Chapter 7. At a slight rise of ground overlooking the swamp, we came upon a group of officers on horseback. I recognized Colonel Hyde right off. A fine-looking man with a narrow mustache, stumpy beard, and receding hairline rode beside him. "Well, so this is the third," he shouted. "Boys, look at that swamp. I have to know if anybody's back there. You have to find out." "We will, General Smith," Colonel Hyde replied. "Captain Harrington, form your command." "Yes, sir," the captain muttered. As Captain Harrington waved the men into a line, I stood staring at the general. Here was the famous Baldy Smith, a Vermonter like me, who was now in command of a whole division. A while back, Little Mac himself was up here, Julian Scott told me. Companies E and F were forming a reserve, and Julian had managed to escape for a few moments. "General McClungin?" I whispered. "Is it going to be a regular battle like Bull Run, then?" "Don't think so," Julian said, motioning toward the nearby artillery batteries. Only half were manned, and the 5th Vermont, over to our left, was only sending a few men out as skirmishers. "Looks like Mac had more important things to do," Wheeler declared. "Has to get some more balloons up, maybe." "Company D, form skirmish line," Lieutenant Buck shouted, and then I turned rigid. "No, stay back," Willie told me. "That drum won't do much good in a charge. We'll serve as runners and stretcher bearers." Running messages from place to place didn't seem so bad. I didn't want to think about stretchers, though, about wounded and dying friends. "Company F, form skirmish line," Captain Sam Penegreed, their commander, shouted. I turned to look for Captain Harrington. He was growing pale, and once again Lieutenant Buck took charge of things. Company F raced up and formed a second line. "It's in your hands, Captain," Colonel Hyde said as he waved toward the swamp. "Yes, sir," Captain Harrington replied. Those hands seemed awfully nervous to me. Wheeler and I followed the captain as he approached the swampy ground in front of us. "Beat and advance," the captain instructed. I began tapping on my drum, and Wheeler blew a tune on his fife. The Company F drummer started playing, and our two lines began to advance. We soon reached a narrow dike, and the companies halted. Lieutenant Buck and half of our company cautiously crept across the dike. Others followed. I glanced at Captain Harrington, but he appeared to be in no hurry, so I rushed ahead to be with my tent mates. "Get back, Willie," Lando growled. "That drum's not going to kill any Rebs." "No, but it can steady the men some," I argued. We crossed the dam and stared at a stream. On the far side, a line of earthen mounds rose. That was the rebel line. Company D spread itself out opposite the line, while Captain Pengree deployed Company F behind us. "I don't see a thing," Russ whispered. "Where are the Rebs?" "Maybe they've fallen back to Richmond," I suggested. "Don't you bet your life on that," Sergeant Currier muttered. "Fix bayonets! Unfasten your waist belts and hold them high. Try not to get your cartridges wet crossing that stream. Be ready to charge." After days and days of drill, the men responded to orders with a precision that amazed me. I didn't really know what to do with myself, but I decided if there was going to be a fight, I ought to be with my friends. Captain Harrington, who was a senior to the other commanders and thus in charge, hung back. Lieutenant Buck led us into the shallows, and once we started across, Captain Pengree left Company F forward. "Well, there's no retreating now," Cal remarked, "not with those elf boys and their bayonets behind us." We were better than halfway across the stream when the first of our cannons opened up on the rebel entrenchments. The shells roared overhead and whined down the opposite side of the stream. Some exploded over the trenches, other blasted gaps in the enemy fortifications, and more than a few fell harmlessly into the trees in back of the rebel line. The stream was deeper than it had appeared, and I had to swim across 15 feet or so. Some of the other youngsters did likewise. The older, taller men managed it better. They held their rifles and cartridge belts up to keep them dry. We emerged on the far side, formed up, and advanced. I saw my first rebels a few minutes later. They swung their rifles out over their earthen walls and let loose a fierce volley. I heard the series of pops, and I saw the powder smoke obscure the trench line. Then my ears picked up a buzzing sound like bees flying around. It seemed for a minute or so that the world stood still. A man here and there fell back as if tipped over by a giant hand. "Calvin?" Lando called. Blackie turned toward his brother, and Cal Stebbins turned back as well. Lando gazed out then with a bewildered stare, dropped to his knees, and fell. "Lando!" Russ shouted. I got to him first, though. I had a little bag of bandages, and I knelt down and opened it, hoping to bind Lando's wound. The bandages had gotten soaked crossing the creek, though. "Don't bother," Sergeant Currier said, helping me back to my feet. "He's past helping." I stared at Lando's frozen eyes. Their lifeless gaze chilled me to the bone. Lando had 2 big holes in his chest, and I thought for a moment I was going to be sick. "Beat the advance, Willie," the sergeant urged. "Let's take that line before we catch a second volley." I took a deep breath, exhaled, and beat my drum. The men raised a great howl and raced forward. Those whose powder had remained dry fired their rifles, while others fixed their bayonets. The Rebs rose up and met us, but their colonel, a tall man brandishing a saber, drew most of our fire. When he went down, the other rebels lost heart, scrabbled out of their trench, and fled. We show them the price of tangling with the third," Moses Torrance shouted. I rushed back to have another look after Lando, but he was just as dead as before. Russ and Blackie sat beside him, folding his arms across his chest. "Form up!" Lieutenant Buck shouted. "Form up!" "Watch 'em, will you, Willie?" Russ asked. I nodded, and the surviving Stephen brothers raced to take their place in our thinned-out line. Company F crowded in beside us, and the reserve companies E and K crossed the stream. We were now better than 200 strong, but nobody seemed to know what to do. Captain Harrington appeared surprised that we had made the crossing. "Wheeler, go back and tell the colonel that we have taken the rebel works," the captain ordered. "Ask him for support." Wheeler pocketed his fife, nodded to me, and raced back towards the stream. He, too, had to swim a good portion of the way, but he splashed out on the far shore and continued onward. The action was growing hotter by the moment in the rebel trenches. Off to our left, and especially on the right, the rebels opened up on us. There were a lot of them, and their fire began knocking down men in 2s and 3s. "Where's our support?" Lieutenant Buck shouted. I turned to look for Captain Harrington, but he had vanished. There was a collection of soldiers cowering behind a large earthen mound, and I hurried over there. "Willie, for God's sake, get down," Julian Scott shouted. I trembled and fell. His face tightened up. Once I got to my knees, he seemed relieved. "Thought you were dead for sure," Julian said, hauling me along to safety. "Is anybody in command?" "Don't ask me," I said, gazing around at the confusion. Some of the sergeants managed to gain control of their squads, but fresh batches of Rebs popped up everywhere. Our artillery resumed its bombardment, but the gunners were shooting blindly. The Rebs began closing in, and their fire peppered our thin line. "I'll see if I can find an officer," Will Scott volunteered. He no sooner got to his feet than a Reb ball struck him in the chest. "Help me," Julian cried, cradling Will's head. I opened my bandage bag and took out the soggy bandages. With Julian's help, I wrapped Will's chest and stemmed some of the bleeding. Then we carried him back to the stream's edge. "I better fetch my drum," I declared as Julian started into the stream. "I've got him now," Julian told me. "Go find that fool captain of yours and see if he can get us out of this mess." I turned back, retrieved my drum, and crawled along the trench, calling for the captain. "He's back on the far side of the stream," a Company F soldier told me. "Captain Pingree's taking command." I located Captain Pingree sitting on a nearby flour barrel. A sergeant was bandaging the captain's bloodied hand. "Good, here's a drummer," Captain Pingree said, grabbing my shoulder with his good hand. "Son, once this fool finishes his handiwork, I want you to beat recall." "Recall?" I asked. "Retreat," he said grimly. "If we had a call for run like the devil, I'd suggest that. We're being murdered here, and it's clear no help is coming." "Yes, sir," I replied. I waited for the sergeant to finish, and then Captain Pingree nodded, and I began drumming. I never beat that drum half so hard in my whole life. The men began stumbling back, firing off a few dry cartridges they had left. Then the whole lot of us ran back towards the creek. The only thing that saved us was that the Rebs stayed put. If their brave colonel had survived, he probably would have charged after us and killed everyone. I drummed and drummed until Captain Pingree finally grabbed my arm and halfway threw me into motion. The two of us raced along towards the creek, and then he cried out and fell. His sergeant and I turned back. "Now this one's going to be hard to explain to the wife," Captain Pingree said, clasping his buddy Rump with his one good hand. The sergeant laughed, handed me his rifle, and lifted the captain up onto his shoulders. I stumbled along after them. The stream was a mess. Dead and wounded littered the shore, and soldiers discarded their rifles and cartridge belts as they dived into the water and swam for safety. I helped the sergeant swim Captain Pingree across. Only then did I see Captain Harrington. "Why did you wait so long to pull the men out of there?" Captain Harrington shouted. The men muttered a dozen answers. Then one, and more than one, questioned his courage. There was Sam Pingree with one hole in his backside and a thumb shot clear off. Who had a right to question Captain Pingree about anything? I didn't stay around to learn more. Instead, I raced over to where Julian Scott was dragging another wounded man ashore. I set my drum down and helped ease the man to the dry ground. "Take care of this one for me, will you?" Julian asked, handing me the dispatch case in which he carried his drawing materials. He gave me his fife, too, and then he kicked off his boots, skinnied out of his trousers, and peeled off his shirt. "You don't mean to go back there," I cried. "There are 2 or 3 wounded men on the other side," he explained. "Someone's got to help them." I sighed and started unbuttoning my tunic, but Julian waved me back. "Stay here and tend Will," Julian insisted. Will Scott, pale as death, managed to grab my wrist and keep me there. Julian splashed into the stream and swam across. I counted 2 other trips he made, and I have to say it was close to the bravest thing I ever saw. "Just goes to show," Will mumbled. "Don't have to be tall to have grit." I nodded. Will was slowly bleeding to death, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it. "You did fair yourself," I told him. "Mr. Lincoln knew what he was doing, giving you another chance." "He just let the Rebs do the general's work for them," Will said, wheezing and spitting blood out of the corner of his mouth. "But I suppose my folks will take it easier this way." I tried to stop shaking. It was hard, sitting there among the dying. Landon was gone. A few feet away, Jerry Bishop and his pa sat, both of them bleeding. Who knew how many other Company D friends were among the dead? And I was haunted by the thought that any minute some Reb might drop Julian, and I would be shy another friend. "It's time to retire, boys," Captain Harrington announced. "Help the wounded. Stretcher bearers, bring along the serious cases." I gazed up at him. Stretcher bearers? Where were the stretchers? "Never mind," Julian said, grabbing my shoulder with his soggy hand as I angrily turned towards the captain. "Help me with Will."